Hello, my dears. My name is Esther Bennett, but most people call me Grandma Esther. I'm 74 years old, and I've lived a life filled with both heartache and triumph. The story I'm about to share with you is one that's been tucked away in my heart for more than 60 years. It's a story of pain, betrayal, and loss, but above all, it's a story of survival and resilience. I was born in 1951 in a small town called Brookside, nestled just outside of Birmingham, England. I grew up in a modest three-bedroom house, much like many of you probably did. My father, William, was a coal miner, working long hours underground to provide for our family, while my mother, Evelyn, worked as a seamstress from home, stitching clothes for the ladies in town. Our house was always filled with the sound of the sewing machine, and the smell of freshly ironed clothes hung in the air. I was the fourth child with three older brothers, Thomas, who was 20, Samuel, who was 18, and Oliver, who was 16. My father often said that having me, a daughter after three boys, was the greatest gift he could have ever received. He called me his little star, and for many years I truly believed that I was the luckiest girl in the world. My father would come home from work, carrying sweets in his pocket, and scoop me up in his arms, even when I was nearly too big for him to do so. He made me feel like I was the most cherished person on the planet. But the world has a way of changing, sometimes when you least expect it. The trips my father took to the mines began to get longer, and his returns became less frequent. There was a day in 1964 when he left for a work assignment that was supposed to last a few days, but it stretched into weeks. That's when things began to change at home. It was just me and my brothers that day. My mother had gone to deliver some clothes to a client, and I was left behind to take care of things at home. I never imagined that the worst thing to ever happen to me would take place right in the very house that had once felt like a safe haven. Before I continue, I want to ask all of you to please give a like to this video and subscribe to my channel, The Silent Stories, for more stories like mine. Your support means the world to me. Also, I'd love to know where you're watching from, so drop a comment telling me which country you're tuning in from. It's incredible to see how far this community of wonderful people has grown, and I'm so grateful to be able to share my story with you. Now let me take you back to that day in 1965 when my life took a drastic turn. As I mentioned, my family wasn't rich by any means, but we were full of love, laughter, and the kind of simplicity that made life feel warm. Our house was small, but it was our home. It was a place where we gathered around the dinner table every night, where my mother would tuck us in at night and whisper, "I love you," as she kissed our foreheads. My father, a man of few words but deep affection, would sit in his worn-out armchair after a long day at the mine, his hands calloused but gentle, and look at me as if I was the whole world. That was the life I knew. It was the life I thought would never change. But everything shifted when my father started spending more time away, working further from home, sometimes not returning for weeks. My brothers, with their own lives growing more complicated, didn't seem to notice the changes that were creeping into our family. They were older and more interested in their own lives, out with their friends, or finding work to help out with the bills. But the more they left the house, the more it felt like it was just me and my mother holding everything together. By the time 1965 came around, I was 14 years old, still a child, but becoming a young woman in a world that wasn't kind to girls like me. My brothers, especially Thomas, began to show me attention in a way that made me uneasy. At first, it was small things, an odd comment here or a lingering look there, but by March of that year, things began to take a more disturbing turn. I remember it vividly. My mother had left the house that afternoon, running errands and doing some laundry for the town's wealthier families. It was a usual routine for her, and she trusted us to look after ourselves. I was busy in the kitchen washing dishes when I felt someone behind me. It was Thomas, my oldest brother, and he stood much too close. "Esther," he said, his voice unfamiliar, with a strange tone that sent chills down my spine. "You're growing into such a beautiful young woman." I tried to move away, but his hand grabbed my arm. The room seemed to close in on me, and my heart started racing. "What are you doing, Thomas?" "Let me go," I said, trying to pull free, but my plea went unheard. Samuel and Oliver, my other two brothers, appeared in the doorway moments later. Their faces had an expression I'd never seen before. Something dangerous, something cold. "What's going on here, Thomas?" Samuel said, his voice too calm as if he already knew what was about to happen. I couldn't speak. I didn't understand it. This wasn't how brothers were supposed to behave. They were supposed to protect me, not hurt me. I was frozen in fear, and what happened next is something that I've never truly been able to escape from. They took turns, each one of them, violating the trust and the love we once shared. I was a girl trapped in my own house, unable to move, unable to cry out for help. They told me that no one would believe me if I ever told anyone. They told me it was my fault. They told me that I had asked for it. The day they left, I didn't know how to move. My whole body felt as if it had been torn apart, but the worst part was the silence. No one could hear my screams. No one knew the truth. When my mother came home that evening, everything was as if nothing had happened. I had to pretend. I had to lie, to smile, to act as though everything was fine. When she asked about my day, I couldn't even look at her, but I said, "Everything's fine, Mom." And so we continued to live like this, my mother believing everything was normal, me hiding my pain behind a facade of normalcy. I hated myself for lying to her, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth. Now I know that the shame wasn't mine to carry, but back then I didn't know how to fight. I didn't know how to speak out. Next, I'll share with you the terrifying days that followed, when my world fell apart, but somehow I kept surviving. So stay with me. The days after that horrible afternoon felt like they were moving in slow motion. I kept my head down, my heart heavy, and my thoughts constantly running in circles. My body ached in ways I couldn't explain, but it was the emotional pain, the guilt, the confusion that was the hardest to bear. Every time my brothers looked at me, it felt like they could see through me, like they knew I was broken, but they didn't care. I kept pretending. I went to school, I did my chores, I tried to smile when my mother would speak to me, but inside I was falling apart. I became a shell of who I was. The once talkative, lively girl that my family knew disappeared. I stopped talking to my friends, stopped paying attention in class, and my grades began to slip. My teachers noticed the change. I could see the concern in their eyes, but I didn't know how to explain. How could I? How could I possibly tell them the truth? By the time my father returned home from his trip, I was barely holding it together. His return was always something I looked forward to, but this time it felt different. I felt like I couldn't look him in the eye, not because I didn't love him, but because I knew that the man I had once seen as my protector would never see me the same way again if he knew the truth. But nothing prepared me for what happened next. It was one late afternoon in May when my father came home early. He had surprised us all. He was supposed to be away for another few days, but instead he showed up unexpectedly. I had been sitting in the living room staring at the wall when I heard the door open. I turned around, and there he was, standing in the doorway with his tired eyes, a suitcase in hand, and a smile on his face. "Hello, Princess," he said, walking over to give me a big hug, just like he always did when he returned home. But something was different this time. I couldn't bring myself to embrace him. "Dad, I'm glad you're home," I said, forcing the words out, my voice trembling. But as he pulled away, his gaze landed on me with an intensity that I hadn't seen before. My father was no fool. He had always been able to sense when something was wrong, when things weren't quite right. "Louise, what's going on? You don't look like yourself. Have you been crying?" he asked softly, his voice full of concern. He reached for my face, brushing his hand gently against my cheek, but I flinched, pulling away without meaning to. "I'm fine, Dad," I whispered, barely able to keep my voice steady. "I'm just tired." But he didn't buy it. His brow furrowed, and I could see the wheels turning in his mind. "No, sweetheart, something's not right," he said, his voice firm but loving. "You know you can talk to me, don't you?" I wanted so badly to tell him the truth. I wanted to scream it all out, to collapse in his arms and finally let the weight of the pain that had been choking me for so long spill out. But I couldn't. I was scared. I was scared of what he would think, what it would mean for our family. My brothers, his sons, how could I ever betray them like that? How could I ever make him believe me? So I lied. I'm just stressed out, Dad. Please, I'm okay, I said, forcing a smile. But inside, I was dying. That night, my father kissed me goodnight as he always did, but there was something in his eyes, a sadness, a suspicion that I couldn't shake. I thought I had gotten away with it. I thought I had fooled him, but in the pit of my stomach, I knew I hadn't. He knew something wasn't right and he wasn't going to stop until he figured it out. The next morning, everything changed. It didn't take long for my father's suspicions to grow stronger. The following days felt like they were under a constant cloud of tension, and I could feel my father's watchful eyes on me. Every time I moved, every time I spoke, it was as if he could see through the walls I was building around myself. I tried so hard to maintain the illusion of normalcy, to keep up the facade, but it was starting to crumble. My brothers, on the other hand, became more daring. Their behavior grew bolder, more arrogant, as though they had nothing to fear anymore. They knew my father was distracted by the pressure of his work, and my mother was always busy with her laundry and sewing jobs. They knew that they had control, that they could do whatever they wanted, and there was nothing I could do to stop them. It became a routine, a dark and horrifying cycle. Every time my mother left the house, they took their turn. Sometimes one of them would act as a lookout, standing in the doorway to make sure no one was coming, while the others took what they wanted. There were no words, no warnings, just actions. My body was no longer mine. It was theirs to control, to manipulate, and every time it happened, I died a little more inside. I tried so hard to fight back, to scream, to push them away, but their strength overpowered me, and I learned to stay silent, to just let it happen, hoping that if I did, it would be over sooner. But it never was. Each time it felt worse, more violent, more cruel, and with each attack, the guilt and shame grew heavier. I stopped looking at myself in the mirror. I couldn't stand to see the girl staring back at me. She wasn't the same girl who once laughed and played with her brothers. She wasn't the girl who had a bright future ahead of her. She was a broken version of herself, someone who had been taken from the inside out. One afternoon, after an especially brutal episode, I lay on my bed, exhausted, my body battered and bruised. As I tried to make myself disappear, I wanted to vanish, to cease to exist, because I couldn't understand why this was happening to me. Why was I being treated like this by the very people who were supposed to protect me? But even as I lay there, lost in my own pain, I still carried a sliver of hope. I held on to the thought of my father's return, hoping that when he came back, everything would be all right. He was my protector, my hero. I thought that if he knew, he would make everything stop. He would stop them, he would protect me, and I would be safe again. But how could I tell him the truth? How could I make him believe me? I couldn't bring myself to speak it out loud, to confess what was happening in the house that was supposed to be my sanctuary. The shame of it all was too much. My brothers, my own flesh and blood, they had taken everything from me, and no matter how much I wanted to tell him, to scream, I couldn't. I feared that if I did, I would destroy our family forever. I would be the one to break us apart. Each night, I prayed for the strength to endure, for the courage to face the truth. But with every passing day, the truth felt further and further away. The weight of what I was going through started to press on me in ways I couldn't ignore anymore. At first, I thought I could keep it all inside, that I could somehow manage the pain on my own, but the burden became unbearable. Every day felt like I was living in a fog. I was slipping further and further away from the person I had been. I was losing myself, and no one seemed to notice. I was desperate for someone to see, to understand the torment I was enduring. My teachers, my friends, even the neighbors, surely someone would notice. But the problem was that I couldn't say it out loud. How could I? Who would believe me? And worse, what if they didn't believe me and made it worse? The lies that my brothers had planted in my mind were taking root. They had convinced me that no one would believe me, that I was the one at fault. They had stripped me of my confidence, my sense of worth, and I was left doubting my own reality. One day I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at my reflection, trying to find a trace of the girl I once was. But the girl who looked back at me was a stranger. I didn't recognize her anymore. She was hollow, empty, filled with sadness that I couldn't express, but something inside me stirred that day. I knew I couldn't keep pretending. I had to tell someone. I had to speak the truth. I needed to reach out, even if it was just to one person. The problem was, I didn't know who that person would be. Who could I trust? I thought of my friends, the ones I used to talk to at school, the ones who had once made me laugh. They had no idea what was going on in my life, and I wasn't sure how they would react if they found out. What would they think of me? I had already isolated myself from everyone around me, but the idea of finally opening up terrified me. I was afraid of rejection, afraid of being judged, afraid that they would see me as weak or as someone who had allowed this to happen. There were moments when I thought about telling my mother. I thought about sitting down with her, looking her in the eyes, and saying the words I had kept buried for so long. But each time I imagined her reaction, the heartbreak, the guilt, the anger, and then the shame I would see in her eyes as she looked at me, the daughter she thought she knew so well. How could I put her through that? How could I be the one to destroy her, to tear apart the family even more? Still, the pressure to tell someone was mounting. I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of my silence, like I couldn't breathe unless I shared my pain with someone who could help me. I tried to find an escape, a way to avoid the truth, but it was impossible. It followed me everywhere. Then, one afternoon, after weeks of internal torment, I found myself standing at the front door, ready to walk to the neighbor's house. Mrs. Henderson, the kind woman who lived 2 doors down, always gave me a smile when I passed by her house. She was gentle, always warm, always asking how I was doing. Maybe, just maybe, she could help. I had no idea what I was going to say, no idea how to even begin, but I couldn't go on like this any longer. But just as I reached for the door handle, I heard the sound of footsteps approaching. My father had come home early again, and this time he was looking for me. When my father came home early that afternoon, I thought for a moment that everything might finally be okay. Maybe he had sensed that something was wrong. Maybe he was here to help me. But as he walked into the house, I could feel the tension in the air, the way he scanned the room as though he was searching for something, anything that wasn't right. Louise, he called gently, his voice a mixture of concern and curiosity. Where are you, princess? I was standing in the hallway, frozen, my hand still on the doorknob. He walked over to me, his face creased with the weight of his own thoughts. He had always been a man of few words, but when he spoke, his voice carried a warmth that made you feel safe, like he could make everything better. But today was different. Dad, I was just about to. I started, my voice trembling. He stopped me before I could finish. You don't have to lie to me, Louise. I know something's wrong. I looked into his eyes, and I saw it, suspicion, yes, but also a deep aching love. My father was no fool. He had been the protector of this family for so long, but I could see it in his face now. He was scared. He was afraid that his worst fears were about to come true. I've been watching you, he said quietly, sitting down at the kitchen table. His gaze never left me as he spoke. Something's different. You've been so distant. You're not the same girl you were before. I swallowed hard, my throat tight with fear. I couldn't let him see the truth. I couldn't bear the thought of him knowing, of watching him shatter before my eyes. I'm fine, Dad. Really, I whispered. But even as the words left my lips, I knew they were lies. I felt sick to my stomach. My father shook his head slowly. his expression firming into something that I had never seen before. It was determination. He wasn't going to let this go. Louise, sweetheart, I'm not blind. I know something's wrong. I don't know what it is yet, but I will find out. I wanted to scream, to beg him not to dig any deeper, but I couldn't. I was terrified that if I didn't say something, he would find out in some other way, some way I couldn't control. The weight of my secret felt heavier than ever, pressing against my chest, threatening to suffocate me. Then, to my shock, he stood up and walked over to the phone. He dialed a number I hadn't recognized. "Hello, Officer Lawrence. This is George Bennett. Um, I need you to come over. I'm worried about my daughter. Something's not right." I felt my heart race in my chest as I heard the words come out of his mouth. My mind went into overdrive. The fear gripped me like a vice. Was he about to take me to the police? Was he going to expose everything, even if I wasn't ready to tell him the truth? What if he didn't believe me? What if he turned on me, like my brothers had done? I stepped back, my feet unwilling to carry me anywhere. My father was looking at me now, a strange mix of fear and resolve in his eyes. "Louise, please, you need to tell me what's been going on," he said softly, his voice filled with anguish. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. I felt a lump in my throat that I couldn't swallow, a lump made up of months of fear and shame. And then, just as I was about to break down and finally tell him everything, I heard something that stopped me cold. A sound I wasn't expecting. It was the sound of my brothers, the unmistakable sound of Anthony's voice, and Samuel's and Oliver's, all of them standing just outside the door. "Dad, you can't do this," Anthony's voice called out, and I could hear the panic in it. "I'm sorry, but I have to," my father said, his voice low and controlled, yet trembling with the emotion he was trying to suppress. I froze in place, my legs shaking. I knew this moment would come. The truth had to come out, but I wasn't ready for it to be like this. Not like this. And then it happened. The door to the kitchen opened, and my brothers stepped inside. My heart sank as I looked at each of them. Anthony with his cold, defiant expression, Samuel trying to avoid eye contact, and Oliver, who looked as though he had just seen a ghost. It was in that moment, standing in that room, with my father and my brothers, that everything changed. The secrets I had been holding in for so long were about to explode, and I could no longer keep pretending. My father turned to me, his voice a mixture of fear and disbelief. "Louise, is this true?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Is this what they've done to you?" I couldn't answer him immediately. The words were stuck in my throat, and the shame was overwhelming. But my father wasn't going to let me hide anymore. "It's time to tell me the truth, Princess," he said gently, his hand resting on my shoulder, urging me to speak. And finally I did. Finally the words came out in a rush, tumbling over each other, breaking free from the walls I had built. I started, but then I saw the look on my brothers' faces. Fear, panic, and then something else. Guilt. I took a deep breath and said the words that would change everything. "Yes, Dad. It's them. It's my brothers." The moment those words left my mouth, everything changed. It was as though the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving behind a suffocating silence. My father stood frozen, as if he couldn't comprehend what I had just said. His hand, which had been resting on my shoulder, fell away, and he took a step back, as though he needed space to process the impossible reality of what he was hearing. His eyes searched mine, full of disbelief, confusion, and pain. I could see the agony in his face. The man who had always been my protector was now a man crushed under the weight of the truth. The room was still, except for the sharp, frantic breaths coming from my brothers. Anthony, the oldest, stood with his hands clenched at his sides, his face pale, his mouth slightly agape. Samuel and Oliver, both younger than Anthony, stood behind him, too afraid to speak, too afraid to move. "You're lying," Anthony finally managed to choke out, but even his voice trembled. "You're just confused, Louise. You don't know what you're saying." "No," I whispered, shaking my head. I know exactly what I'm saying, Anthony. I know what you did. The weight of the words hung in the air, and for the first time, I saw fear in my brother's eyes. Fear that their secret was about to be exposed. Fear that everything they had done would finally come to light. My father didn't say anything at first, he just stood there staring at me, his face drained of color. I could see his mind working, trying to process the horror of what was unfolding in front of him. He was trying to make sense of it all, but there was no sense to be made. Then, without warning, he turned away from me and walked toward the phone again. His hands were shaking as he picked up the receiver. "I'm calling the police," he said, his voice rough, filled with a broken determination. "No, please," Anthony shouted, but it was too late. My father had already dialed the number. "Hello, Officer Lawrence. This is George Bennett. I need your help. Something terrible has happened to my daughter, and I need you here immediately." His voice cracked, and I could hear the raw emotion that he was desperately trying to hold back. The call was short, and within minutes the doorbell rang. I felt a sudden rush of cold fear wash over me. The police were here. They were coming to take my brothers away. I had been too afraid to tell anyone, too afraid to let the truth out, but now it was happening, and there was no turning back. The police arrived quickly. 2 officers, a man and a woman. The woman, Officer Jennings, was kind but firm, her expression gentle yet full of authority. I could barely meet her eyes as she asked me to sit down in the living room. My father sat beside me, his hands still shaking, his face pale, as if he had aged 10 years in a matter of hours. Officer Jennings spoke softly, asking me to recount everything that had happened. Every detail, every moment of what I had suffered. It was harder than I ever imagined it would be, harder than I thought I could bear. But the words came out, one by one. I told them everything. When I finished speaking, Officer Jennings looked at me with a compassion I hadn't expected. "You're very brave, Louise," she said quietly. "You did the right thing. This is over now. We're going to make sure you're safe." I didn't feel brave. I didn't feel like anything. All I felt was numb. The weight of what I had just shared, the fear that came with it, was almost too much to carry. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was not alone anymore. I wasn't carrying this secret by myself. The truth had finally been spoken. The officers then turned to my brothers. I could see the panic in their eyes, the way they fidget, unable to look anyone in the eye. Anthony, Samuel, and Oliver were taken away, each one handcuffed, and led out of the house in silence. I could hear my father behind me, his voice breaking as he called out to them. "How could you do this to her? How could you do this to your sister?" But none of them answered. The next few hours were a blur. The paramedics arrived, and I was taken to the hospital to be examined. They confirmed what I had already known. The abuse had taken a toll on my body. The trauma was deep, physically and emotionally. The doctors told my father that I would need extensive care, both medical and psychological. The internal injuries were significant, and they feared I might never be able to have children. I didn't care about that. All I cared about was the fact that I was finally safe. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. My father stayed with me in the hospital room, holding my hand the entire time. He never left my side, and I could feel the love and guilt pouring off him in waves. He was devastated, not just by the revelation of what had happened, but by the fact that he hadn't seen the signs sooner. "I should have known," he kept repeating, his voice heavy with regret. "I should have been here. I should have protected you." But I didn't blame him. He couldn't have known. No one could have. The next few weeks were a blur of police interviews, hospital visits, and endless tears. My brothers were arrested and charged, but I didn't feel the sense of justice I thought I would. I didn't feel relief. All I felt was numb. The healing had only just begun, and I had no idea how long it would take, or what the future would hold. The truth had been revealed, but the aftermath was far from over. My brothers were arrested, and the house was filled with a heavy silence. My father, once a pillar of strength, seemed a shell of himself, his eyes filled with an overwhelming mixture of rage and sorrow. He would often mutter to himself, "How could they? How could my own sons do this to her?" My mother, on the other hand, was in shock. She couldn't process it. She sat in a corner of the house, rocking herself back and forth, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as if she were trying to hold on to something, anything to make sense of the chaos. The tension between my parents grew. My father couldn't look at my mother without feeling the weight of his own guilt. I should have protected her, he kept saying, as if he could have somehow prevented it all. My mother, however, was too lost in her own grief. She couldn't even look at me without breaking down. As for my brothers, it was as if they ceased to exist. My father refused to say their names. He didn't even want to hear about them. My mother, on the other hand, was torn. She loved her sons, but how could she reconcile the truth with the image of the boys she had raised? The house felt cold, empty, haunted by the memories of what had happened. And even though I was surrounded by people, I felt more alone than ever. The days that followed were a blur of chaos and grief. My brothers, locked away in separate cells, remained absent from the house, but their presence still lingered in the walls and the air we breathed. The house, once filled with warmth and laughter, now felt like a prison, a place where the shadows of betrayal and guilt haunted every corner. My father, a man who had always been steady, calm, and reliable, was barely recognizable. He would sit in his chair for hours, staring blankly at the wall, his hands trembling as if he couldn't find the strength to hold them still. The man who had once been my hero seemed broken, undone by the realization of what had happened under his roof. And my mother, she withdrew further and further into herself, lost in her own world of anguish. I could see her in the kitchen, absent-mindedly folding laundry, but her eyes were vacant, distant. She couldn't look at me without feeling a deep, gnawing shame. The shame of being a mother who hadn't protected her child. There were moments when she would come to my room, sit beside me, and stroke my hair, but the words we both longed to say never came. How could she ask for forgiveness when she hadn't seen the signs? How could I forgive her when all I wanted was her to be the mother I needed in that moment? The silence in our home was deafening, broken only by the occasional sob from my mother, or the sound of my father pacing back and forth in the living room. It felt as though our family had shattered into a million pieces, and no one knew how to put it back together again. But despite the fractures, one thing was clear. We couldn't stay here. My father, sensing that the walls of Riverdale were closing in on us, made the decision to leave. We would start fresh in a new town, far from the whispers and the pain. But even as we packed up our lives and left everything behind, I knew that the scars would follow. The memories of what had happened were permanent. But perhaps in a new place, with time, we could begin to heal. In August of 1966, we left Riverdale behind, the town where my whole life had been turned upside down. It felt like an escape, a chance to start over in a place where no one knew our story, where the memories of what had happened could fade into the past. My father requested a transfer at his job, and we moved to New Hope, a small town about 250 miles away. The house we found was modest but peaceful, located near the Delaware River. It was a fresh start, a new beginning that we desperately needed. My father no longer had to travel for work, and for the first time in a long time, he was home every night. My mother, too, found work at a small bakery, keeping herself busy, trying to find solace in the simple tasks of baking bread and pastries. The change in scenery and routine was meant to heal us, but the pain didn't fade with the distance. My nightmares followed me here. The old fears of my brothers, of being trapped, still crept into my mind, even though we were in a new place surrounded by strangers who didn't know what had happened. I was enrolled in St. Mary's Academy, a Catholic school where no one knew my past. At first, it felt like a relief. No one whispered behind my back. No one looked at me with pity or morbid curiosity. But despite the fresh start, I couldn't shake the feeling of being different. I was a stranger to myself. The girl I used to be, the one who laughed and spoke freely, felt like someone I had left behind in Riverdale. At school, I kept to myself. The other girls in my class tried to be friendly, but I kept my distance. They didn't know me, and I couldn't bring myself to open up to them. The pain of my past was still too fresh, too raw, and I couldn't let anyone close enough to see the cracks in my soul. But my parents were trying. They were trying to move on to live a life that wasn't defined by the horrors we had left behind. I saw my mother smile more, though it was a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. My father, too, tried to be present, but I could see the weight he carried, the guilt, the regret, the fear that he had failed me as a father. Life in New Hope was quieter, but it didn't bring the peace I had hoped for. I was still haunted by the memories, and as much as I wanted to leave the past behind, it was a part of me, woven into the fabric of who I had become. The first few months in New Hope were filled with an overwhelming sense of disorientation. We were strangers in a new town trying to rebuild lives that had been shattered. My parents tried their best to create a sense of normalcy, but I knew the cracks in our family were still there. My father, despite his best efforts to be present, seemed distant at times, lost in his own thoughts. My mother, though she smiled more often, still carried a sadness in her eyes. As for me, I was barely holding it together. I had nightmares nearly every night, reliving the horrors of what had happened. The fear, the confusion, the shame, it all came back to me in my dreams, and I would wake up drenched in sweat, unable to shake the images. I tried to pretend that I was adjusting, but the truth was, I was anything but okay. My parents insisted that I see a therapist. At first, I refused. I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want to face what had happened, didn't want to relive the pain, but eventually I gave in. It was either that or continue to let the pain consume me. Therapy was a strange experience. The words didn't come easily. I couldn't find the right way to express the depth of my trauma, but slowly, with the help of Dr. Roberts, I began to unpack the years of hurt, the layers of fear and shame that had been buried deep inside me. It wasn't easy. I would leave some sessions feeling more broken than when I arrived. But over time, I began to realize something. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't to blame. The abuse had been real, and it wasn't my fault. I learned that healing wasn't linear. Some days were better than others, and some days I felt like I was drowning in the weight of it all. But with each passing day, I started to rebuild my sense of self. I started to understand that I could survive this, that the abuse didn't have to define who I was or what I could become. My parents, too, began to heal in their own ways. My father, though still full of guilt, started to spend more time with me, and we began to reconnect in a way that felt more genuine. My mother, who had been so lost in her own sorrow, started to find joy in the small things again, cooking for us, spending time in the garden, making our home feel like it once had. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. For the first time in a long time, I began to feel like I could move forward, like I could have a life beyond the darkness that had defined me for so long. As time passed, I started to feel more like myself again, though the scars of the past still lingered. I wasn't the same girl I had been before, but I was learning to accept the person I had become. The nightmares were still there, and the fear still sometimes gripped me at night, but with each new day, I felt a little stronger, a little more capable of living a life that wasn't controlled by the trauma. It was during this time in the spring of 1968 when I met John. He was a quiet, kind man, a fellow student at the University of Pennsylvania, where I had started to attend classes. We met at a mutual friend's birthday party, and I was immediately struck by how different he was from the other people I'd known. He wasn't like the other guys I had met, insistent, aggressive, or looking to impress. John was patient, calm, and most importantly, respectful. When we first started talking, it felt so easy. We talked about everything: books, movies, the weather, nothing heavy, nothing personal. It was refreshing. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could be myself without fear of judgment. At the end of the night, John asked if he could call me sometime. Just to talk, he added with a gentle smile. Sensing my hesitation, no pressure, I just think we could be friends. I agreed. And over the next few weeks, we talked on the phone. His kindness was like a balm to my wounded soul, and for the first time, I felt like I could trust someone again. He never pushed me to talk about my past. He never asked about my family or the dark history that I carried with me. Instead, he let me go at my own pace, offering nothing but understanding and patience. When we went out on our first date, just to a movie, nothing special, I was nervous. The idea of intimacy, even something as simple as holding hands, terrified me. But when John reached for my hand, I instinctively pulled away. He noticed immediately, his face softening with understanding. "Sorry," he said quietly, without pressing me. "I won't do anything you don't want." Those words, so simple, so obvious, but so powerful, were like a revelation. For the first time in years, someone respected my boundaries, didn't push me, and didn't make me feel like I owed them anything. It was a feeling I hadn't realized I'd been craving for so long. As our relationship grew, I felt myself opening up. Slowly, carefully, I started to share little pieces of my past with him, bits and pieces. Never the whole story, but enough for him to understand that there was more to me than what he saw. John never pressed for more. He simply listened. He showed me that love didn't have to be something that hurt. It could be gentle, kind, and safe. It was hard, even with John's patient understanding, to let go of the past. The weight of what I had endured was always there, hovering in the back of my mind, a shadow that I couldn't quite escape. I had come so far, but I still felt like I was carrying the ghost of that terrible chapter in my life. After nearly 2 years of being with John, I began to feel something stirring inside me, a desire to confront my past, to address what had happened once and for all. It wasn't about forgiveness, not yet at least, but about facing the truth head on. I realized that I couldn't keep running from it forever. If I was going to truly move forward, I needed to acknowledge the pain and the hurt and somehow find closure. It was a difficult decision, but I felt it was the right one. I wasn't ready to confront my brothers face to face, not yet, but I knew I had to let them know how much they had destroyed me, how much their actions had taken away from me. I had to make them understand the gravity of what they'd done. I sat down one evening and began to write. I wrote a letter to Robert first, the brother who had been the most remorseful, the one who had shown the slightest hint of guilt and regret in the years since the abuse. I told him how his actions had torn me apart, how much I had suffered because of him, and how even after everything I couldn't completely forgive him. I wasn't ready for that, but I wished him peace and hoped that he had found some redemption in his life. Next, I wrote to Joseph, the brother who had distanced himself from me after the truth had come out. I expressed the anger I had carried for years, the anger that he too had betrayed me, that he too had taken part in something so monstrous. But I also wished for him to reflect on what he had done and to truly understand the gravity of his actions. Finally, I wrote to Anthony, the one who had been the ringleader, the one who had pushed the others into doing something that could never be undone. I poured every ounce of anger, pain, and betrayal into that letter. It was the hardest letter I'd ever written, the hardest thing I'd ever done. I told him how he had stolen my childhood, how he had stolen my innocence, and how I could never look at him the same way again. I wasn't sure if I would ever be able to forgive him. The wound was too deep. I sent the letters, each one to its intended recipient, without expecting anything in return. I wasn't looking for their responses. I wasn't even sure I wanted them, but I needed them to know the truth, to understand what they had done. The act of writing those letters, of confronting my past in such a raw, painful way, was liberating in its own way. It didn't fix everything, but it was a start. For the first time, I was taking control of my story. I wasn't letting them define me anymore. The letters were sent, but the response I had expected never came. Anthony, Joseph, and Robert never reached out to me again. Anthony's silence was the most deafening. He never acknowledged what I had written, nor did he ever attempt to apologize for what he had done. Robert, though, sent me a reply, one I didn't expect, one that caught me completely off guard. The letter came months later, after I had almost forgotten about the possibility of hearing from him. It was brief but sincere, filled with apologies that seemed to come from a place of deep remorse. Robert confessed that he had been haunted by what he had done, that my letter had forced him to face the depth of his wrongs in a way he had never allowed himself to before. He said that he was in therapy and had been working to become a better person, a man who would never repeat the same mistakes. Reading that letter was like being hit with a wave of conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted to rip it up, to never read another word from him again. But another part of me, the part that was healing, could see that maybe, just maybe, Robert had changed. He wasn't the same person he had been all those years ago. His letter wasn't a plea for forgiveness. It was a recognition of his mistakes. And for that, I felt something in my heart shift. I didn't respond. I couldn't bring myself to. But I didn't destroy the letter either. It sat in a drawer, a painful but necessary reminder that the past was real, and yet I had survived it. Joseph's silence continued. I never heard from him, and I didn't expect to. He had always been distant, and I was certain that he had no intention of facing what he had done. But I also didn't feel the burning anger I once had toward him. The years had tempered that rage. I had accepted, however reluctantly, that some people were never going to change, no matter how much they needed to. As for Anthony, he was still a ghost in my life. I never received a letter, nor did I ever expect to. His actions had been the hardest for me to come to terms with. He had been the one to orchestrate everything, the one who had manipulated and forced the others to participate. It wasn't just the physical abuse, it was the betrayal of my trust, the destruction of the brother-sister bond we were supposed to share. In my heart, I knew that part of me would never be able to forgive him. The damage he had done was too great, and it was too late for apologies. But life went on. Slowly, in its own time, I began to move forward. I got married to John in 1975, and we built a life together. We had children, Mary in 1977, Peter in 1980, and Anna in 1983. They were everything I had ever dreamed of, and they became my reason to keep going, my reason to live a life filled with love, not fear. In time, the scars from my past became less visible. I learned to be a mother, to protect my children with the same fierce love that I had once craved. And for the first time, I began to believe that it was possible to love without fear, to be loved without pain. John was everything I needed. His love was patient and kind, and he never pushed me to be anything other than who I was. Together we created a life full of joy, of laughter and of healing. But the past never fully disappeared. The nightmares still came, less often, but they came. I could still feel the weight of those years, still hear the echo of my brother's voices in my mind. But I had learned to carry it differently, to let it shape me without allowing it to control me. As the years went by, my life continued to take shape, and with every new milestone, I began to feel more like the person I had once hoped to be. My children grew up strong and secure, shielded from the darkness of my past. They knew nothing of the horrors I had endured, and I was determined to keep it that way. They were innocent, untouched by the pain that had shaped me, and that was something I was fiercely protective of. John and I built a family, one that was filled with love and stability. We watched our children grow, learn, and thrive. There were moments of pure joy, and I often found myself marveling at how far I had come. From the girl who once felt broken beyond repair to the woman who now stood strong, a mother and a wife holding her family together. My parents, too, found some semblance of peace. My father, though still carrying the weight of the past, seemed to soften in his old age. He would sit in his rocking chair and watch the grandchildren play, a smile creeping onto his face as he recalled the good times. My mother, who had once been consumed by grief, began to find solace in small moments, the simple pleasures of life. Gardening, cooking, and spending time with her grandchildren brought her comfort. Though the scars of the past were still there, they no longer defined our lives. They were a part of our story, yes, but not the whole of it. But as much as we had healed, there were still times when the memories would come crashing back. The silence would settle over the house, and I would feel that familiar ache in my chest. My brothers were never far from my mind, though I had tried to put them out of it. I couldn't erase what had happened, but I had learned to live with it. I had learned that I could carry the weight without letting it break me. And then in 1985, I received another letter. It was from Robert. I opened it cautiously, not knowing what to expect. This time there was no apology, no pleading for forgiveness. Instead, it was a simple letter telling me that Robert had turned his life around. He had married, started a family, and had even found work helping children who had experienced abuse. He thanked me for the letter I had sent him years ago, saying it had been the turning point in his life. For a moment, I considered reaching out to him, but I couldn't. I couldn't bring myself to reopen that door. Not yet, anyway. The pain was still too fresh, and I wasn't sure I could face him again. But as I read his letter, I felt a flicker of something, a small shift in my heart. Perhaps after all these years, I could find some measure of peace with him. But it wasn't a peace I was ready to seek just yet. For now, I chose to hold on to the life I had built with John and our children. I knew that if I was ever going to truly heal, I had to let go of the past. And so I did. Slowly but surely, I began to realize that forgiveness, if it ever came, was for me, not for them. Years passed, and my life continued to move forward with the love and support of my family. My children grew up strong, and I found myself becoming the woman I had always hoped to be, a mother, a teacher, and a person who had overcome the darkest moments of her life. But even as the years rolled on, the past remained a shadow lingering in the background, never completely gone. In 2010, when I was 59 years old, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived for me. It was from Robert. At first, I wasn't sure if I wanted to open it. After all, I had spent decades trying to move on, to build a life without the constant reminders of what had happened. But there it was, sitting on my kitchen table, staring back at me. With a deep breath, I opened it. Inside was a letter that once again caught me off guard. Robert had reached out not to ask for forgiveness, but to say goodbye. He had spent the last several years reflecting on his actions and the life he had lived. He had found peace, he said, and he wanted me to know that he would never forget what he had done to me. He also shared that he had been attending therapy and working to become a better person, one who could help others who had been through similar trauma. Reading his words was like reopening an old wound. There was no anger anymore, no hatred, just a deep, quiet sadness. I had already come to terms with what had happened. I had already moved on, but here was Robert asking for something I wasn't sure I could give: closure. I sat with the letter for days, turning it over in my mind. I wondered if I should finally confront him face to face, if we should meet, if I should offer him the forgiveness he seemed to want so badly. But when I sat down to write my response, I realized that there was nothing to say that would change what had happened. I wasn't ready for reconciliation, and I wasn't sure I ever would be. The years had passed, and I had built a life that was strong, that was mine. But I couldn't completely forget what had been done. So I wrote a short, simple letter back. I thanked him for his honesty and acknowledged that his words had meant something to me. But I didn't forgive him, not yet at least. Instead, I wished him well in his life and let him know that I had moved on, that my life was no longer defined by the past. I sent the letter and I never heard from him again, and in a way that brought me peace. As the years continued to unfold, I found that the true reconciliation I needed wasn't with Robert or my brothers or even with my parents, it was with myself. In my youth, I had been broken, torn apart by the people I loved, people who should have protected me but instead caused me unimaginable pain. I had carried the shame of their actions, convinced that I was somehow responsible for what had happened. But with time, I learned that none of it was my fault. I had done nothing wrong. I had been a victim, and I had survived. That realization didn't come easily. There were moments when I was still consumed by guilt, by memories that refused to fade. There were nights when the nightmares would return, uninvited and unwelcome. And yet each time I woke up, drenched in sweat, I reminded myself I survived. And that was something worth celebrating. John, my loving husband, continued to be my rock, my steady anchor through it all. He never pushed me, never demanded anything from me other than to be honest with him. And in turn, I learned to trust again, to love again. Not perfectly, but I loved, and that was a gift I never thought I'd be able to give. As I raised my children, I poured every ounce of love I had into them. I gave them the childhood I never had, the safety and security that had been taken from me. And in doing so, I began to heal. With every meal I cooked, every bedtime story I read, every moment of joy they experienced, I began to reclaim pieces of myself that I had lost. But it wasn't just about my children, it was about me too. I had a life to live, a future to build. And so I did. I found purpose in my work as a teacher, finding joy in guiding young minds and helping them grow. I found peace in my relationships, in my community, and in the life I had made for myself. And yet, even as I rebuilt, the memories never truly left. They couldn't. They were a part of who I was, a part of the strength I carried within me, but they no longer defined me. They were a chapter in my story, not the whole book. By the time I became a grandmother, I had found a kind of peace. My children were grown, and I was watching my grandchildren play, their laughter filling the room, and I realized that I had built something beautiful despite the scars of my past. My father, before he passed, told me that he was proud of the woman I had become. That moment when he held my hand and whispered those words was the final piece of the puzzle. I had made it. I had truly made it. Now at 73, I look back on my life with a bittersweet sense of gratitude. The pain, the trauma, the darkness, it all shaped me into who I am today, and I'm proud of the person I've become. I've learned that healing takes time, that forgiveness, even if it's not immediate, can come in small steps, but above all, I've learned that I am stronger than I ever knew.